Hello, this is Matt from Heaney Apps, and this is part 2 in our Introduction to SwiftUI series. In this video, we will take a look at setting up and using images in a SwiftUI project. So we have some code to do, so let's get to work. For this, I will be using Xcode version 12, and we will hit create a new Xcode project. For today, we want an iOS app, which we will call images. Make sure the interface is SwiftUI, the lifecycle is SwiftUI app, and the language is set to Swift, and hit next, and save it up somewhere nice and safe. Once you have your SwiftUI project, let's hit resume to start off our preview, and once you can see your preview, we are all ready to go. So, as I said, in this video, we will take a look at setting up and using images. Now, before we can set up our first image here in SwiftUI, we have to get the image that we want to use in our app, and we have to import it into our Xcode project. To do this, we have to put an image into our assets folder. So over here on the left, we will move into our assets folder. You can open this menu like so if needed. And all we have to do is drag our image here. Now for this, use any image that you want. And the image I will be using is here on my desktop. So my image is of Sooty the dog. Big shout out to both Sooty the dog and Ryan Parrett for letting me use this image. I used to work with Ryan on the same iOS app dev team, and I used to say that if I ever got back into making these videos, I'd find a way to use a picture of Sooty. So keep a lookout for Sooty throughout this series. So once you have your image, we will drag it into our assets folder like so, and then we're good to go. Make note of the image name as we will need to use it in just 1 second, and then let's jump back into our content view, and now we can set up our image. So for this, we'll go to our content view, which is being displayed over here in the preview. We'll jump to the body, so the piece of code that actually makes up the view, and we will delete the example text object because we don't need this today. So in the body, let's create our image. For this, we will simply say image, and we can say what image we want to use. So between brackets and between quotation marks, we can type our image name, which in my case, this is Sooty. You may have to resume your preview. And just as quick as that, we now have an image in our app. Now that we've made our image, we can now start to use modifiers to really style this view and make it look in the exact way that we want. As a bit of a recap, we can use modifiers to style views, but we can't use them to move views around the screen. SwiftUI has a layout system, which we will check out in the next video. So when it comes to images, what sort of modifiers can we do? Well, we can use modifiers to resize this image, and we can make it as big or as little as we want. Now by default, the size of this image will be the actual image size. So for example, the size of the image that I have imported into Xcode is 200 pixels by 200 pixels. So by default, this image will appear at 200 by 200 within the app. And that's a pretty good default, but chances are at some point you will want to be able to resize your images. So how can we use modifiers to resize this image? Well, the first thing that we have to do is tell SwiftUI that we want to be able to control the size of this image, to ignore the default size it's given this image. To do this, we will use the Resizable modifier. Straight away, this default is ignored and the size of our image now changes. As soon as we use this modifier, the image is going to expand to take all of the space available. It will go to the sides of the phone and then right up to the safe area. Note how the image will stretch to fill this space, and it will break the aspect ratio of your image. So for example, my image here should be a square, but because it's being stretched to cover this rectangle area, that aspect ratio is completely broken. This might look bad, but now that this has happened, we can control that size. When it comes to resizable, there's a few different things we can actually do. Default behavior is to stretch this image to take all of that space, but there's a few different things we can do with it. So for example, what we can do, we can set the resizing mode. We'll leave the capping sets today. We can change the resizing mode to one of two options, either the default, which is stretch, or tile. When it comes to tile, our image will keep its actual size, but it will tile over and over again to fill that space. For today, we'll be sticking to the default behavior, which is stretch. And as stretch is at default behavior, we can just leave this as resizable. So now that we have this control to change the size of our image, how can we actually resize it? Well, we have a few different options. For example, we can use the modifier scaled to fill. What this will do, our image will now take all of the space available, but it will stay in aspect ratio. Because the frame of our image is now different to the frame of the screens, as you can see, we're losing part of the image off the side of the screen. However, when it comes to resizing our images, we do have a few different options. So what I'm going to do, I will comment out this modifier just so you can keep it for a reference. We could also use a modifier which is scaled to fit. This time our image will take all of the available space, staying in the correct aspect ratio, but this time staying fully on display. So scale to fill, the image will stay in aspect ratio, taking all that space but going off the screen if needed. Scale to fit will do something very similar, but making sure the image stays fully on display. The other way we can do this is we can just outright set the frame of our image. So we can set a width and a height. We can do this using the frame modifier, where we can pass in a width, a height, and an alignment. For today, we will just stick to setting a width and a height, and the alignment can be the default. But I will show you exactly what alignment is doing in just 1 second. So now we can set a width and a height for our image. So for example, we can make this 400 by 400. We now have that complete control over the width and the height. And what we can do, we can set both the width and the height, or we can just set the width or the height. And if we was to do this, whichever one we don't set will just default back to taking all of the space available. So for example, if I just set the width, the height will take that default, which is stretching out to taking all of the size available. But for today, we will set a width and a height. Now sometimes setting a frame is dangerous because this can throw off the aspect ratio of our image, making it look really weird. So for example, my image is square. But if I had a width of 200 and a height of 400, this image is going to start to look pretty stretched. Now what we can do, we can make sure this image doesn't look stretched by setting an aspect ratio for this image. So we can set the frame, but make sure it still looks how it's supposed to look. To do this, before we set the frame, we can set an aspect ratio modifier, and we can pass in either fill, where our image will take all of the space available, but it will break out the frame if needed, or fit, where the image will fit within the frame, keeping its aspect ratio, but then leaving these spaces above and below in this case if needed to keep that aspect ratio. Setting the aspect ratio like this is very similar to what happens when we use scale to fit or scale to fill, but this time we can work with a custom size for our frame rather than just using all of the space available, which in this case is the entire screen. Now, as you can see, when we use fit for our aspect ratio, this image will default to the center of the frame. You can change this using the alignment when you set the frame modifier and when you set the width and the height. However, for today, I'm just going to set my frame to be 300 by 300, which I think is a good size for this image on this device. So that is how we can change the size of our image. But with modifiers, there's so much more we can do. For example, we have a whole bunch of different modifiers which will let us change the shape of our image. So the simplest way that we can do this is just by curving the corners of our image. And we can do this with a corner radius modifier. So if we set a value of like 20, for example, as you can see, we now have a nice curved corner on our image. It's a really subtle effect, but I think it looks pretty cool. But we can go even further than just making the corners rounded. For example, we can completely change the shape of this image. So what we will do, we will use a modifier to make our image circle. And this could be used, for example, in a social media app where a user would upload their profile picture. It'll probably be a square or a rectangle, but you might want to make that image round on their profile. And this is as quick and as simple as using the clip shape modifier and passing the shape, in this case, a circle. And as you can see, our image is now a circle. The thing is, we can go even further with this, and we haven't even got to use any of these built-in shapes to SwiftUI. And we can use a custom image mask. To show you what I mean, I'm going to import one more image into my Xcode project. So I'm going to go back to my assets folder, and I will import this image here, my star mask. And this is just a basic star that I made in preview. And there'll be a link down in the video description for where you can download this image if you want to check this out for yourself. So what I'll do, I'm going to import this image into my assets folder, and we will use this image to make our picture change shape to be in the shape of a star. So what we will do, we will add a modifier, which is mask. And here we can set what mask we want to use. In our case, we will be using an image as our mask, and we can specify what image we want to use. Mine is called star mask. And we can add a modifier to the image for our mask to make it resizable. like so. I will hit resume, and just like that, our image is now in the shape of a star. I think this is a really cool modifier. It's almost endless possibilities. You can pretty much make any image appear as any shape in your project. However, for today, we will stick to our image being a circle. So that is a few different ways that we can change the shape of our image. Let's jump on to look at one more set of modifiers, which will allow us to change the appearance of our image. So one of the ways that we can change the appearance of the image is to give our image a border. We can do this with the overlay modifier, and we can pass in an object which will act as an overlay for our image, which we can modify to make it look like a border. For this, as our image is a circle, we will use a circle shape, which will completely cover up our image. We can change this by setting this stroke modifier on the circle, where we can pass in a color and a line width to control how thick the border is. Just like so, we now have that border around our image. We can change the color and we can change that line thickness. We can also set a blur on our image by using the blur modifier, and the higher the number, the more intense this blur is. Now, side note, this blur is a perfect example of why the order of our modifiers matter. If we have this blur after the border, our border is blurred, but if we have it before, then the border will not be blurred. We can give our image a shadow using the shadow modifier, and then passing in a number. The bigger the number, the more defined the shadow. And we can use some modifiers to change the actual colors of the image. For example, we can set the saturation, where the higher the number, the more rich these colors become. And if we make the number low enough, it will turn this image black and white. Let's set it to something like 3, which is the default. We can set a hue rotation to modify our colors, passing in an angle. And we're also going to set a blending modifier for if you have multiple images stacked on top of each other, where you can make them all blend together. Now, I get we only have one image today, so it will blend with the white background. But when we learn about Z stacks in the next video, you'll be able to stack images on top of each other. So you might find some good uses for this next modifier at some point in the future. So let's use .blend mode. And for this, we have a whole bunch of options. So have a look through them and see exactly what each can do. So as you can see, for example, if we use color burn, we'll make our image look like this on the white background. So hopefully that's given you a pretty good look at using images here in SwiftUI. Now, before we wrap up this video, I have one more thing that I want to show you. So at the moment, we're taking a look at this image here on one device. The device used here is whatever device is selected up here. So for me, Xcode has selected the iPod Touch as this default selected device. So that is what this device is here. Now, the size of this image looks pretty good on this device, but it would be a dangerous game to assume that as it looks good on one device, it will look good on all devices that can run this app. As I'm sure you know, there's a whole bunch of different screen sizes that your app will have to run on if you wanted to release an app to the App Store. So what we can do, we can use the previews here in SwiftUI to do some pretty cool things to kind of see how this image would look on a whole bunch of different screen sizes all at the same time. So for this, let's move into our preview provider down here underneath our content view. And at the moment, this is saying display the content view, which is our view which contains our image. Now what we can do here, we can override the default to say show the content view on a certain device. We can then go one step even further and we can say show me the content view on multiple different devices. So over here on the right, we'd have lots of devices showing our app. So how would this work? Well, what we can do for our content view, we can set a preview device where we can specify a device to show the content view on. This name here will be the name of the devices from up here. So for example, if I wanted the content view to be shown on an iPhone 11, I would take this name from here and I will type in iPhone 11. It might take a minute to build again. And when it builds, we'll be able to now see our image on an iPhone 11. We can now, as I said, take this one step further and set up multiple previews all running at the same time. So what we would do, we will set up a group, allowing us to run multiple previews. In this group, we will have the content view on the iPhone 11. We can also run it on, say, the iPhone 8, and perhaps one more device, maybe the iPhone 8 Plus. Give it one moment for all of these previews to build and run. And then once these have all successfully built and run, as you can see, we now have multiple devices over here, and we can see how this image will look on multiple devices. Now the really cool thing is we can zoom out, and I have to zoom out enough to see multiple devices on this screen. But what we can now do is if we wanted to make a change to this image, so for example, if I wanted this image to have a frame of 400 by 400 rather than 300 by 300, it will update on all of these devices all at the same time. So now you could modify this image as you go and see how it would look on multiple devices to make sure you're happy with this image across all of these possible devices. So that wraps up our look at images in SwiftUI. And that wraps up this video. As always, post any questions or any comments down in the comment section. If you liked watching this video, which I really hope you did, make sure to hit that like button, hit subscribe, smash that bell button. And once again, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.